In this video, we are going to be looking at an overview of supply. All right, so we're just going to quickly talk, or we'll see how quickly, but we're going to try to quickly talk about some of these major topics that concern supply, really the foundational things. We're going to talk about what the supply curve is, quantity supplied, and the law of supply. That's really the gist of this video. All right, before we start doing some graphical stuff, there are a couple of definitions that I want us to have, and then we'll kind of incorporate those back in later. All right, so the first one is I want us to define the supply curve. So just like with our demand curve, this is what we kind of refer to as the supply most of the time, or at least it's a representation, a graphical representation of supply. And it is a function showing quantity supplied at different prices. All right, and once we get to the graphing portion, we're going to notate the supply curve as a capital S. All right, now we're going to talk a little bit more about this in just a few minutes, but I want to go ahead and put in our mind before we look at the next thing, the kind of determining criteria, or the thing that really determines what our supply curve is going to look like, is costs. We're not going to get too deep into it. We're going to try to look at a kind of a fundamental or rudimentary example of this, but the cost of producing a good is what is going to drive that supply. All right, and we're going to see that again in just a moment. All right, but before we do that, let's take a look at the next thing, which is quantity supplied. All right, so hopefully we remember based on the lectures from kind of the demand lectures, right, or the demand videos, supply and quantity supplied are not the same, just like demand and quantity demanded are not the same either. Right? They are not the same thing. They are related topics, but they are not, or related ideas, but they are not the same thing. So quantity supplied is the amount of a good producers are willing and able to sell at a given price. Right, so again, just like with kind of demand, the supply curve is the entire curve. It's a set of kind of matching observations of price and quantity supplied. Quantity supplied is a part of that set, right? So each quantity supplied will be tied to a specific price. The supply curve shows that quantity supplied at all different prices. All right, and we notate this once again, when we get into graphing, or just if we have to do something mathematically, Q with a subscript S, that is how we notate that quantity supplied. All right, so just like we have a law of demand, we also have a law of supply. So the law of supply states that ceteris paribus, so again, that's our Latin or whatever for all else equal. All right, so saying nothing else is changing, all right, but what we're about to say. All right, as price increases, quantity supplied increases. So again, right, holding everything else constant, nothing else is changing. The only thing that's changing is the price, right? If the price of a good increases, the quantity supplied of that good is also going to increase. Now, fundamentally, this makes sense, right? If you can charge a higher price, then you can get a higher profit, and you can, make more money. So, of course, if the price is higher, you're going to increase the amount of good that you're supplying, right? While this is true, it's not the whole picture, right? So really what we're looking at here, again, the supply curve is derived based off of producer costs. So how much it's costing producers to make a good. And not all producers have the same costs, right? So different producers have different costs, right? Some might have access to specific types of machinery or technology capital in general that makes it more efficient but just more efficient to produce this good and therefore making it cheaper, right? Some producers might have a source of inputs that will give them a lower priced input, so if you're making cement, you might know Wanda down at the quarry, and she gives you a good deal on lye that the other cement companies don't, right? This, again, a silly example, but right, there are a bunch of different factors that go into this. All right, so when we are looking at this fact that price increases cause increases in quantity supplied, it's not just that producers are going to want to sell more of their goods because now they're going to make more money off of it. It's actually more that as that price increases, right, then more producers can cover their costs of production. All right, so let's take a look at this idea while also looking at kind of how we could derive a very basic supply curve. All right, so now there's a lot of stuff in here that we're not gonna get into the exact details. We're not gonna get very specific. If you go on to take higher level economics courses, you'll probably run into some of this and get it in a little bit more detail. But let's say that we are looking at the production of some good, all right? And let's say that there are 10 producers with a cost of $1. All right, so for simplification, and let me say this, let's say that each producer is only going to produce 1 unit of this good, again, just for simplification. And so when we have the cost, right, so we haven't really gotten to this, and this is more of a micro thing. So if you're in one of my macro sections, this might not actually really come back around. And honestly, I don't know if it fully comes back around in micro. I can't remember off the top of my head. That might be a later kind of more advanced thing. But no, it's not. We talk about it in micro, right? But under a certain model, certain assumption, right, the marginal cost of producing a good is going to equal the price, right? And so we're just going to act like if this is the cost, and we'll just simplify that to just costs in general. So we're going to say that a producer has to get at least the cost of producing the good in order for them to be willing to make the good, right? That makes sense, right? You're not going to, if you can't at least cover your costs, you're not going to make any of the good because you're just going to guarantee to lose money, right? But we're also going to say that if somebody offers them at least $1 and that's the only offer they have, they will take that dollar to cover their costs. All right, so let's say that we have 10 producers with a cost of $1, 10 more producers with a cost of $2, 10 more producers with a cost of $3, and we'll just do one more and say 10 more producers with a cost of $4. All right, so what we have on the board essentially is enough for us to create a supply curve. All right, so hopefully you got this stuff written down because I'm about to erase it. let's do this. Well, I guess that was simple enough. I can remember in my head, hopefully. All right, let's just start graphically, and then we might do something else depending on how much time this takes. All right, so when we are looking at our supply and demand, but in this case we're specifically looking at supply. All right, one, just remember that we need to label our axes, all right, as we go. All right, now let's say that this is the supply curve for that gadget. All right, so we can go and we can look. Essentially what we're going to do is we're going to start just looking at the price. All right, so at a price of 0, then we can assume that the quantity supplied is 0 as well. All right, and then at a price of, let's see, how much space did I give myself? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, that's fine. So say a price of $1, how many units of this good are being supplied, right? And if you look back to that information that was on the board just a second ago, right, and we know that their costs are $1. There are 10 producers with a cost of $1 per unit, right? And so there are 10 right, there are 10 producers willing to sell their good for $1. Right? When we increase, if we increase the price, so again, the reason that these 10 producers are willing to sell their 1 unit each is because they have their costs covered. Right? Then if the price increases to $2, well, now there are 10 other producers who are able to have their costs covered and therefore are willing to sell their good. Right, so we go from 10, the 10 that were originally there, then we add the additional 10, so that's why we have 20. Right, then we just continue doing this. All right, we raise the price to $3. Right, there are 10 more producers that get their costs covered and are willing to produce this good. And then of course finally up here squeezed in, we've got 40 at $4 each. All right, and that is how we get our supply curve, right? Again, all right, this follows the law of supply because it is upward sloping. So as the price increased, so did the quantity supplied. Again, this is because these producers are now able to cover their costs. And so you are, it is very much that producers that are already having their costs covered will be incentivized to increase production if they can, right, without increasing their own costs. But so that is a possible and a very real reason why we also see quantity supplied increase. But another also equally important thing is that some producers that were unable to make a profit at a price, right, when that price rises, if they may be able to make a profit now, and so they're going to join the market as well, right? They're going to jump in here and start supplying their good. All right, we can also look at this kind of in a little table, because that information that we had, I'd put up on the board, that is just our price and quantity supplied. Right, so for each of these different prices, right, we've got our quantity supplied, right? We used this information to make our supply curve, right? So again, the supply itself, right, is kind of this entire little chart. It's the entire graph once we plot it all out. The quantity supplied is the individual kind of amount that is being sold at a given price. So quantity supplied exists as a point along the curve, right, or a point on the curve. The supply is the entire curve itself. So quantity supplied is a part of supply and not the other way around. One last thing before we close this out in the next couple of videos, depending on what order you watch these in, we're going to start looking at shifting our supply, all right, what things cause supply to shift. All right, so I just want us to briefly talk about what that looks like in case I forget to do it in those videos, which is entirely possible. All right, so we're not going to get into really anything about shifting supply in this video. What we will talk about is what an increase and a decrease in supply look like graphically. So conceptually, probably we all could figure out what a increase or decrease in supply means, but graphically it's a little less clear. All right, so when we are increasing supply, right, one thing that you want to avoid, and this gets a lot of students, is that a lot of times when we see increase, we associate it with kind of up, right? So increasing, higher, going up, right? And so some students want to say, well, if we're increasing supply, we need to move the supply curve up, right? However, that's the exact opposite of what we want to do, right? When we increase supply, we want to shift the curve to the right. The reason for this is because when we are changing supply, what we are saying is that at a given price, we're not at the same quantity, right? So let's say we had P1 here, right? So at this initial, I guess we could say P, we'll just say P star, right? Right? If we are hitting this supply curve at P star, right, then we're going to have a quantity of Q naught. But if we have an increase in supply, right, we increase the quantity, the quantity that's being supplied is different at the same price, and that is fundamentally what we're talking about when we have a shift in supply, is that the same price yields different quantities, right, with this shift. Right, and so we can see that here, right, our quantity increases, which is what you would expect with an increase in supply, right? If somebody says, I'm going to supply more of this good to you, and then you get less of it, that doesn't make much sense, right? And that's exactly what we would be saying if we tried to put our new curve up above the supply, right, the original supply. So again, right, with this, we want to think of this just like with demand. Think of it as a shift to the right rather than a shift up. All right, similar thing with a decrease. You can probably figure out where this is going, but when we decrease supply, we're going to shift that curve to the left. All right, so again, this works for both demand and supply. Right, whether if we're increasing demand or increasing supply, we're shifting the curve to the right. If we are decreasing demand or decreasing supply, we're going to shift the curve to the left. All right, so in the next video, we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between changes in supply and changes in quantity supplied. So there's we've already been trying to make that distinction between supply and quantity supplied, but we're going to kind of get into it a little bit more in the next video. We are also probably going to at least briefly go over the shifters of supply. All right, but I will see you in the next video.